If you grew up as a Star Wars fan anytime after 1999, you were absolutely spoiled when it came to, well, everything. Outside of the movies that were finally seeing new life, you had infinitely more comics, books, and toys than a fan that grew up in the era of the original trilogy. You had that initial backlog of media to enjoy, as well as the insane drive to get the old Star Wars bandwagon rolling again in the lead up to The Phantom Menace. Life was good, but if you were a gamer, it was even better. During the 80s and very early 90s, Star Wars games followed the usual pattern that all movie tie-in games did. You had your side-scrollers, your top-down shooters, even a proto-FPS. And it's not that Lucasfilm lacked ambition or anything. Their gaming division, LucasArts, had been around since 1982, but the rights to develop Star Wars games had been licensed, leaving LucasArts to work on original IP. But in 1993, LucasArts was once again able to publish original Star Wars games. Here you had a group of, at this point, veteran game developers who had been honing their craft for over a decade, and they were finally able to work on the IP that blasted George Lucas and his bank account into the outer rim. No pressure. So the team at Totally Games, a Marin County-based developer who'd been working with LucasArts since the 80s, got to work on what they knew best, flight simulators, which brought us 1993's hit, Star Wars X-Wing. X-Wing was unsurprisingly a giant hit, selling out the weekend of its release and blowing LucasArts' expectations out of the water. 100,000 launch units, gone, with retailers ordering another 500,000 by December of that year. But while George Lucas was diving Scrooge McDuck style into an imperial swimming pool full of credits, there was another phenomenon developing on the gaming scene in 1993, one that was far more addictive and demonic than anything the dark side had to offer. Doom was not the first-person shooter, but it was the first position to take both the over- and underworld by storm. Wolfenstein 3D had come from id earlier in 1992 and was undoubtedly a hit, hailed as the grandfather of 3D shooters, but from the beginning, it didn't quite know what they initially had, and they still had some lessons to learn. Hard cut to 1993, and those lessons, and a whole lot of satanic imagery later, id came out with the Doom, and Doom had a hell of a lot more to offer than Wolfenstein 3D. The gameplay was tighter, the engine was smoother, easier to mod, and perhaps most importantly, Doom had a multiplayer mode. The poor, God-fearing Christian nuclear families of the 90s didn't know what hit them, but they knew it was cool. But this isn't a Doom retrospective, is it? Seeing the success Doom was having, but more importantly, the countless Star Wars-themed custom levels being designed for it by fans, expanding into the FPS market was a no-brainer. Darren Stanette, a man you'll come to know very well, said it best. The whole genre cried out for Star Wars. Stanette, a 29-year-old self-taught programmer from Seattle, was brought on board in July 1993 to be the project leader of this Star Wars FPS, a game that would come to be known as Dark Forces. With the release of Doom just months away, Stanette had to keep his own personal force in balance. The game had to meet and exceed LucasArts' expectations while making Star Wars fans happy, all while he never actually developed a game for PC before, let alone an FPS. Oh, and he didn't have a team yet. He started with 2 programmers that just so happen to have the most Star Wars sounding names imaginable, Ray Gresko and Winston Wolfe, and the 3 set out to build the engine the game would run in. Next on the hiring block were level designers, a specialty Stanette didn't know much about, just that he wasn't good at it. I tried to design a level myself, Stanette explains. It soon became clear that I couldn't do it, but I found out what it takes. The more I researched it, the more it seemed like architecture than anything else. The complex mathematics and spatial relationships inside a game like this are much like those in building a house. Fortunately, while in a movie theater, no doubt waiting to see the 1993 smash hit Surf Ninjas, Stanette was telling his buddy about the project and how much of a pain in the ass level design was, when a stranger in another row suggested he turn his attention to UC Berkeley, which at the time had a program that blended architecture and technology together in just the way Stanette had described. Enter Ingar Shu and Matt Tateshi, as well as Jim Current and Brett Tosti, both of the LucasArts testing department. The team was slowly coming together and pouring most of their effort into building the engine. Initially developed in assembly, the engine was then rewritten into C to take better advantage of the modern hardware gamers would be running. The devs were walking a tightrope when it came to beauty versus performance in-game. They had not only a need to create one of the most believable and enjoyable worlds to walk around in, but it had to be believable as a Star Wars world. Layering their commitment to maintaining a steady frame rate while also innovating on the elephant in the room, Dark Forces is a Doom clone, but it's not just a Doom clone. You don't just have one door that you walk in to start the level and another door you walk out to end the level. You have elevators and large vertical distances that the player could actually see from ground level in real reach. You had puzzles that slow down the gameplay in between the faster, action movie-esque shootouts that force the player to stop and think. All of this was thanks to the dynamic engine being constantly improved upon. But without a killer story to keep players engaged, Dark Forces really would just be another Doom wannabe. Fortunately for the dev team, they had a secret weapon that was even more powerful than the Death Star. Without that pesky design flaw, lead artist and writer Justin Chin was inspired by the capabilities of the engine, and knew if anybody was going to write the story, it was going to be him. The first challenge Chin identified, not unlike that of a bad hyperdrive motivator, was that they needed to write the story and fast. He wasn't interested in interference from higher ups, so he wrote the whole thing in less than a week. According to the Dark Forces Player's Guide, Chin started writing on a Thursday and produced the first design document the following Tuesday. It contained background sketches of major characters, as well as descriptions for 32 missions. Each mission had a mission objective and a look and feel description of the world and Imperial enemies the player would face. Those 32 missions would be pared down to 14. With most of the look and feel descriptions being what the level designers had to work with, if at all. This allowed them a large amount of freedom when building out levels, which was done in AutoCAD of all things. I've never used AutoCAD before, but I've had to work with people who do, and even almost 30 years later, that sounds like torture to me. But for the level designers hired from Berkeley, this wasn't cruel and unusual punishment, it was fast, and it was efficient. They could go from nothing at all to a world that could be explored and playtested very quickly, allowing them to be fast and flexible with their designs, changing to match the oh-so-critical design philosophy. It's gotta be Star Wars. Convincingly Star Wars. In an interview from 1995 with EGM, Darren Stanette explained that the last thing the dev team wanted players to do was just walk through the movies. They wanted something new, something inspired by the universe George Lucas had created, instead of being a direct copy. And the result? Perhaps for the first and only time, the man responsible for putting a stop to the Empire's nefarious plans, our hero, named Kyle. Kyle Katarn is more mercenary than rebel, but as a former Imperial himself, he holds no loyalty for the Empire. He's joined by his partner, Jan Ors. The story of how they came to work together is expanded upon in the fantastic instruction manual included with the game. Remember those? Kyle was attending the Imperial Academy when his parents were killed in what he was told was a rebel ambush. Outsiders were clearly able to see it was a cover-up for Imperial activity, but for Kyle, it ignited a deep hatred for the rebels. Meeting Jan Ors, who at the time was working as a double agent in the Imperial Intelligence Corps, she saw in Kyle the pain the lie had caused, and did what she could to subtly push him closer to the truth behind the death of his parents, which started a friendship between the two. When Jan's cover was blown and she was taken prisoner, Kyle used his position to help Jan escape to a rebel base, where Jan admits that Kyle isn't fully on board with the rebel ideals, but his hatred for the Empire means they have an ally and an asset in him that would be hard to find anywhere else. With this in mind, we find Kyle right before the Battle of Yavin, infiltrating an Imperial base on Danuta to steal the Death Star plans. Yes, those Death Star plans. After successfully retrieving the plans, Mon Mothma sets the true plot of Dark Forces in motion, an Imperial attack on a rebel base on Talay that decimated their forces. The only reports that made it out, the Empire has a new type of soldier, one the Rebel Alliance has never fought and won. But before I go and spoil anything else for you, I'm going to give you the opportunity to play this game for yourself. So just go ahead, boot up your copy of Dark Forces on your 4K 1977Hz monitor, running on your blistering fast T16 graphics card, and oh my. So this is Dark Forces. It's not terrible. It runs out of the box, at least for me, but it shows its age. Some people like this, and I think this is the way old games should be played, but for all the talk about the Dark Forces engine we've done up to this point, I have to let you know there is another, more elegant engine for a more civilized age. This is where the Force engine comes in, a complete reverse engineering and rebuild of the Jedi engine. Spearheaded by Lucius DXL, the Force engine is a source port that requires an existing copy of Dark Forces to play, and provides a laundry list of quality of life improvements such as high-resolution support and modern control schemes. TFE, of course, also supports what you'd expect, mods and custom levels. And because this is a source port, you can run levels that were created even back in the day, like this one. Installation is all too easy. Just unzip the Force engine to a desired directory, run the setup, and it should automatically find your existing GOG or Steam copy of Dark Forces. To be honest, there's not much more you could ask for. But I do have one suggestion. Grab the latest version of the Dark Forces patch. I will link it below. I was a bit of a nerf herder and assumed the Force engine had these changes baked in. It obviously wouldn't because it's a source port, but here we are. I played through the entire game without it, and most of my complaints go away once this patch is installed. Reading through the massive list of issues the patch addresses, in my opinion, the fixes to the puzzles are the most important, but don't sleep on the other changes. Before I continue, I'd like to thank Lucius for taking the time to speak with me, as well as the entire Force Engine team for their hard work to bring Dark Forces to a new generation of gamers. They don't take donations, for obvious reasons, but playing and providing feedback goes a long way. So now that your Dark Forces install has taken a much needed dip in a bacta tank, what are we actually working with? Well, to start, literally right from the start, you get to hear that iconic theme, albeit the 8-bit version. Dark Forces sound designer Clint Bajakian pushed hard for CD quality sound, but as one would expect when picking a fight with resource-hungry designers, audio unfortunately lost out. But Clint persevered where he could. If he couldn't have 16-bit audio, then 8 would have to do. Care was also taken when it came to matching the iconic sound effects with original ones, without overdoing it. The idea for the team was simple. If what we're seeing is something iconic, like Darth Vader or TIE Fighter, they get the original treatment, both for sound effects and John Williams' score. That's what people know and love. And I must say, from the voice acting of the stormtroopers,
Stop where you are.
the sound of blaster shots, it's all authentic. Weapons especially fit extremely well. The E11 is such a mainstay during the early game that when we finally get introduced to other weapons, they don't stand out for being anomalous in this world. They stand out for sounding sick as hell. And that's where the team allowed Dark Forces to really lock its S-foils into attack position. Whenever we see new content, characters, new locations, etc., a spoonful of sugar to help smooth over the introduction of something new for the discerning purists out there. And to be honest, for the transition from 16-bit down to 8, those purists have Clint to thank for keeping those iconic themes and sound effects recognizable. He did all the mixing in CD quality to better preserve some of the highs before sampling down. As Clint puts it, you have to be very careful how you convert down in order to maintain the character and cleanliness of the sound. It's easy to make things sound dirty, gritty, which is ironic because dirty and gritty is honestly what Dark Forces does best. The opening level places us in an Imperial base searching for the Death Star plans. It's clean and neat, an industrial fascism sort of vibe. Making our way outside, we find the natural terrain that this base is surrounded by, and can instantly tell this was a facility that was never meant to be found. Not only because the staffing feels somewhat limited, and the defenses are meh, but because what sick bastard would pick Danuta for a research facility? The planet that, from orbit, looks like it's covered by a big brown blanket, according to the fan wiki. The Empire probably looked at this installation the same way they looked at a small thermal exhaust port on their super weapon and went, yeah, it's probably fine. What I'm trying to say is this place looks like it sucks, intentionally, on the part of the developers. I like that. Compare that to the next level, Until Talk Base. There are Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru style corpses everywhere you look. Seriously, this level has more dead meat than a Brazilian steakhouse. But the questions start to form in your head without the game needing to make it obvious. The bombed out architecture does that for us regardless, but the still sizzling remains certainly help. There are walls pockmarked with blaster fire, and the power is even off, preventing us from getting into certain areas. Speaking of which, one of my favorite moments I've had in a game in a long ass time was when I entered this dark room and it would light up when I'd shoot my blaster. It's such a small, basic effect that's entirely missable if you don't go guns blazing into a dark room, but it added a certain intensity that feels relegated almost exclusively to older games like this. Honestly, I could go on. Every mission for the most part feels unique. You've got the Star Wars special, your ice planet, your red planet, and Coruscant, but the real star for me was Nar Shaddaa, the vertical city. It reminded me a bunch of a mix between the multiplayer map's boarding action and Chiron TL-34 from Halo CE. Lots of long hallways in what feels like an endless construction site, dotted with gangster holdouts and endless chasms. Like, I'm not sure how much the huts would parallel the Mafia in real life. This is definitely a place where people get mixed into concrete. I can smell the space hepatitis from here. This is a place where bad people go to do bad things while the endless skyscrapers decay around them. It's that parking garage you pull into and find a homeless man sleeping on the top of someone's Beamer. This is why the Alliance needs a man like Kyle, because Kyle isn't afraid to be that guy sleeping on top of someone's Corellian Beamer. Speaking of Kyle, we do get some glimpses of him, as this game does have cutscenes. Some are more of an FMV style, whereas others are, ugh. But enough about looks. How does it play? Well, the first thing you're going to do is turn off the damn gun sway, so you don't need to pop a Dramamine, and stop sprinting everywhere. If you're prone to motion sickness in first-person shooters, this might be a tough one for you. If I can make it work, you definitely can. And when it comes to making it work, the gameplay would have suffered if it wasn't for the aforementioned Brett Toasty. Brett campaigned heavily in design meetings for them to focus on gameplay instead of just vibes or whatever. I don't know that for sure, but I'm reading between the lines. For example, in Dark Forces, when you die, as long as you have lives, you're respawned at a previous checkpoint instead of sent right back to the beginning. There's no in-game save system, although there is one thanks to the Force engine now, so they had to think proactively about what players might encounter, especially on harder difficulties. From what I can see, you really just end up with more enemies on screen, which can be a bit of a drag to be constantly running out of ammo, but what's important about all of those enemies is how they were actually placed. The fact that you can see the backs of enemies is actually pretty notable. It was important to Toasty that they think carefully about the placement of those enemies. Every encounter should present new and unique challenges because the enemies are not always in the same place or facing the same direction. That's important no matter what difficulty you're on. When you're out of armor and down your last chunk of health, chasing that crate dragon because it's all you've got to keep your heart beating, if there's a grenade hucking bounty hunter with his back to you, that's going to give you an extra second to either run for a healing item or eeny meeny miny mow your way through your massive backpack full of weapons. The choice is completely up to you. And yeah, let's not understate it, we have a giant arsenal of weapons to choose from. The one thing we don't have is a lightsaber, but that's okay. No need to trust in the Force when you've got Force. And it's all thanks to
your fists. Run out of ammo. Give the Empire a good fisting. Modified Braille pistol. For when you forget to switch to the E11 blaster rifle. E11 blaster rifle. The sound conjures just enough serotonin to drown out the sound of your parents fighting. Thermal detonator. For when you want to die. Imperial repeater gun. Is it a blaster? Is it a shotgun? Doesn't matter. Charon fusion cutter. Definitely not the BFG. Mine. Who do you think you're sneaking up on? Accurate mortar gun. Works how a thermal detonator should. Stoker concussion rifle. The only weapon you'll use halfway through the game. And the assault cannon. Basically a fuel rod gun.
Most of them have a secondary fire option too, but I imagine most folks are just going to hold down the trigger until Wilhelm starts screaming. If you really want to be a big old nerd, there's a fantastic, almost novel-length walkthrough for this game on GameFAQs by user K. Lopelman that was last updated in October 1996. Talk about a relic. But inside that virtual, dusty tome is a plethora of useful information, such as this chart ranking how many shots it takes for each weapon to kill each type of enemy. This guide is honestly required reading. Not because this game is particularly difficult, but because it's a love letter stored in a time capsule and it's written in such a sweet way. If you're still out there, Dr. Karsten A. Lopelman, I salute you. Anyway, now's the part of the video where my experience is going to differ from yours if you install that patch I told you about, because it fixes a lot of the confusing and tension-spoiling puzzles. There are two main types of puzzles, platforming ones and smart guy ones. Although with these, the platforming puzzles and secrets aren't too complex. It really just takes some getting used to because the sprinting adds some weird inertia to your jumps. And in the case of secret areas, just keep an eye out. Something that tends to come up a lot are these conveyor belt sort of sections, either by water, sewer, or actual conveyor belts. They sometimes require Jedi reflexes, but for most of them, if you mess up, it's not an instant death and it's not a giant trek back to the start. Now the big brain smart guy ones, they aren't bad either. You get the same hearty, attaboy feeling when you figure them out, but some of them are just not intuitive at all. For Research Facility, the idea is you have to cross a secret little passage, but to make a floor for you to cross, you need the levels 2 elevators to be lining up just right. Is that what this image says to you? Because it doesn't to me. Imperial City, on the other hand, is So this big hexagonal room is full of man traps. Next to each of those doors is a panel that allows you to change what door on that layer is open. But depending on which level you choose, you might be locking yourself out depending on what side you came in on. The goal is to create a path using these alternating doors to get to the center. Do you want to see the clue we have to tell us that? The problem in both cases is there just aren't enough prompts to indicate what you're able to actually influence or change. When you flip a switch, you just kind of go, well, time to go figure out what that did. For the bad puzzles, there's no gameplay elements that help point you in the right direction. But of course, all of this goes away when you use the patch. For the elevator puzzle, it goes from looking like this to looking like this. And for the Imperial City puzzle, it goes from being a static image to actually indicating which level of the door is open. But remember, this is a fan patch and wasn't around for the years when gamers had to figure this stuff out, hence why I'm keeping my complaints in this review. But if the confusing puzzles get you down, you can always cheat, and what cheats they are. Some of the commands are just plain hilarious, like the code to unlock all weapons being postal. The cheats range from being useful and fun to why would anyone ever use this, but that's half the joy of using cheats. And speaking of cheats, I don't want to cheat you out of a fun experience. So if you don't want anything spoiled, this is your warning. So, how about those Dark Troopers, eh? Investigating the blown-up rebel base, we find an experimental weapon, far too large to be used by an average stormtrooper, a weapon that it's decided must be tied to the Dark Trooper program the rebels have heard murmurings of. Luckily, on the barrel of the gun, we find a convenient MR written, which of course must be the signature of the weapons specialist, and I presume war criminal, Moff Rebus, who looks like he'd fit in better as an NPC in Hotline Miami. Hunting through an actual sewer, we find the Moth, who reveals under interrogation that the weapons are indeed of his own design. He conducted weapons testing on the planet Fest, which our contact tells us is a site of metallurgic testing. Here, Kyle finds a sample of the ally being used, Frick, which was historically used by Jedi in the construction of lightsabers. This brings us to the only place Frick can be mined, the mines of Gromus, where we're tasked with sploding them to hopefully slow down the creation of any more DTs. Unfortunately, our Imperial defector fitting us information, Crix Medine, this guy from the movies, has been captured by the Empire, meaning we have to head to the one place every Star Wars fan has wanted to break out of themselves. Cue the detention level. Rescuing Crix, he confirms for us that the head of the Dark Trooper program is General Mok, one of the only Imperial generals who thinks the Death Star is a super dumb idea, and that the Empire should be focusing its efforts on a new type of soldier who can deal more effectively in close quarters. They lay out the DT supply chain like this. There are 3 stages to constructing a Dark Trooper. The first is on Gromus, where they mine the Frick. The second is at a secret robotics facility where the Frick is turned into, Frank or something. Finally, all the components are shipped to a space cruiser called the Arc Hammer, where they can be put together. It's like the Terminator meets Mr. Potato Head. The only problem is we don't know where either the robotics facility or the Arc Hammer might be, as Mok relies on smugglers who take various routes to both locations. The only thing we know for sure is that these smugglers all start their journey from the same place, Ramsey's Head. Our goal is to sneak in, plant a tracking device on a smuggler's ship, and let it lead us to the robotics facility. We discover this facility is on Antivi, but it's more like Anfreezy because this is an ice planet. This level is designed with so much verticality to explore and endless chasms to die in, it's fantastic. Infiltrating the facility, we plant 3 detonators to hopefully take out the whole plant when we finally come face to face with our first Dark Trooper. It's just a droid, but good lord is it a beast. There's a few weapons that are particularly useful against it, but this guy will chase you relentlessly. In this footage, it looks like I was maybe kiting him, but no, that's me running for my life, and him choosing to play peekaboo with the inside of my chest cavity. As we exfil, we run into more Dark Troopers in various stages of construction. Successfully destroying the robotics facility, we take a quick jaunt to Nar Shaddaa to find some navigational data, since we discover a large number of ships are passing from Gromus to Antivi, and Jan suspects this is where they're picking up those routes. What's even better is the Empire has placed a large bounty on my head, and Nar Shaddaa is essentially a smuggler's den. Woo. This goes as well as you'd expect, with Kyle and Jan being captured by Jabba the Hutt because you know him from the movies. I mean, he's part of the Dark Trooper Kickstarter campaign, and he needs you to stop blowing stuff up. We escape pretty easily, finding our gear, blasting some Kell Dragons, rescuing Jan, head to Coruscant, do this horrendous puzzle, grab the location of the final stop on the smuggler's route, a refueling station, and that's about it. Nothing else too exciting. Oh, I guess we have to kill Boba Fett or whatever. No big deal. Almost finally, we discover that the Arc Hammer makes frequent jumps through hyperspace to stay hidden, with only one ship knowing where it is at any one time, a super star destroyer called the Executor. We get on board, posing as a smuggler, and sneak into the cargo destined for the Arc Hammer. After taking that ride, we're given a simple, familiar task: set 3 charges and blow it up. After cutting down enough Dark Troopers to consider them little more than an annoyance, we're finally faced by one final big boy, General Mok himself, wearing a Dark Trooper suit. This boss fight made me sweat a little, I won't lie. I definitely made good use of the save system introduced by the Force engine. After taking out Mok, Kyle jets from the Arc Hammer as it explodes, receiving a medal from Mon Mothma with all the fixins, including a title card and some credits. Now, if you're a fan of modern Star Wars, you no doubt will have recognized the Dark Troopers. From the LEGO set 75324 Dark Trooper Attack. No, just me. I know, we saw them in Mandalorian Season 2. Although they looked more like Purge Troopers, there's not a bunch of information on the canon version of these guys. They were introduced in a mobile game in 2014. It seems like these guys were developed in reverse compared to the Dark Forces variety. The canon DTs started as a sort of exoskeleton before Moff Gideon removed the pilot to make them exclusively droids for the third generation, which is the version we see in Mando. Whereas the OG version from Dark Forces was always designed to be a droid, with Moff creating his own exosuit inspired by the design. It's sometimes hard to review these older games because you often have to compound the legacy and what it brought to gaming along with the actual quality of the product as it stands up nowadays. But Dark Forces made my life considerably easier because it's the quality of that finished product that contributes so much to its legacy. Dark Forces and Doom are inextricably tied together when we look at early first-person shooters on PC. After all, EGM gave Dark Forces a 95, only because they gave Doom a 96, and the inspirations were too close to ignore. But I think the weight of translating a beloved franchise like Star Wars into game form worked in the developers' favor, because this meant they always had to be innovating and differentiating, trying to crawl out from under the massive shadow of the films to help their creation stand on its own 2 feet, no different than the similarities one might see with Doom. Dark Forces innovates in a few ways Doom hadn't, because they were just as interested in exploring the bounds of the medium in an original way as id was with Wolfenstein 3D. The only reason we call it a Doom clone is because that's what first-person shooters were at the time. As for the characters and story it introduced, Kyle Katarn and Jan Ors would go on to star in way more titles, in a lot of ways becoming the most identifiable Star Wars gaming protagonists. Without these original characters, who knows how many games would have had Luke going on his 327th secret mission to save the galaxy. The Dark Forces team had the foresight and the brass thermal detonators to stick something new and original in front of content-devouring and perpetually unpleasable nerds and come out on top. Dark Forces would see a sequel, which I'll gladly take a look at if there's any interest, as well as spawn the Jedi Knight series, which would in turn spawn the Jedi series, which just saw the release of its second game last week. And hey, while that game is nearly unplayable in its current state, at least on PC, maybe pick up Dark Forces and take a trip back in time. You know, when Star Wars games ran above 20 frames a second. Thank you so much for watching. If you notice I sound a little different or like words are running together more than usual, that's because I'm fighting with constantly losing my voice due to a medical issue. So anytime you hear certain words just trail off, it's because quite literally it was just too painful to properly hit those syllables. I know, I'll give my voice the rest it needs. Star Wars is just such an important franchise to me. I knew I wanted to honor it alongside all the other nerds in the galaxy. If you enjoy my content and want to support me, please subscribe and share my content with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you really like it, I do have the option for you to buy me a coffee. The link will be in the description. My posting has been very infrequent, and I know that. The winter is a really difficult time for me when it comes to motivation and productivity, but part of the reason why my voice is so rough is because I've recorded roughly 5 hours of voiceover for 3 different videos, all well past the 50% mark of completion. So I promise, just stick in there. I've got loads of content coming your way.
Escape from an analog nightmare. This is luck in yours, I wish you.